In the ancient world and the Middle Ages, the ship represented the very pinnacle of military might. To rule the waves was to rule the world. But during the Age of Discovery, as ships charted new territories and crossed vast, unknown oceans, life for a sailor was incredibly tough. This era was also ripe for mutiny. When an aggrieved crew turned against their captain, all hell could break loose, and out in the middle of the ocean, there was nowhere to hide. That's why some particularly horrifying punishments were created for out-of-control sailors. Welcome to the world of Keelhauling. You've probably seen movies depicting mutinies on the high seas, or sailors who just refused to follow orders. For such a transgression, the punishment had to be severe. In the middle of the ocean, you simply can't afford to let discipline slide. But on the other hand, if a captain was too stern, he might inspire a conspiracy to take him out. That's what we call a mutiny. Perhaps the most famous of these was the mutiny on the Bounty. A captain had to be hard, but fair, or risk losing the respect and control of his crew. So, the most common punishments weren't as extreme as Keelhauling. More often, an offending sailor would receive a few strokes of the cane, or worse, the whip. Sometimes, he might just be tied to the mast to reflect on his actions. But let's say a sailor was part of a failed mutiny. Or what if the villains of the seas, pirates, wanted to make a brutal example of someone? What was the worst thing they could do? They might be hanged, but it was a particularly painful type of hanging. Instead of being dropped, the person would be hoisted up by the neck with a noose, run up the yarm that's the cross-section on the mast where the sails are set. A documented case of hanging by the yardarm occurred in 1860, involving Royal Marine John Gallagher on the HMS Leven. There were also cases of men being thrown overboard. In one infamous instance, however, the men hadn't committed a crime. The crime was committed against them. It's now known as the Zong Massacre, where 130 enslaved people were thrown overboard a British ship. And then there's the punishment you've all heard of from pirate stories: walking the plank. Despite being the most recognizable pirate punishment, it's mostly a thing of fiction. There are a few recorded instances, like an 18th century mutineer confessing he made his officers walk the plank blindfolded. But the details are sketchy, and many historians believe it never happened. While some newspaper reports from the era sound true, walking the plank was certainly a rare event. So now we come to keelhauling, which definitely did happen and was arguably worse than any of the punishments we've mentioned. The keel is the backbone of the ship, the very bottom part. When someone is hauled under that keel, it's called keelhauling. The person would be tied with ropes and dragged from one side of the ship to the other, or even worse, dragged the entire length of the ship from bow to stern. As you can imagine, this was unpleasant, to say the least. You might think, well, if it's quick, I could just hold my breath and make it to the other side, but that wasn't really the case. Bashing against the ship's hull would be incredibly painful. There was a high chance of broken bones, or a head injury could mean the person was pulled up dead. It was an extreme punishment because the hulls of these wooden ships weren't smooth. They were covered in barnacles, those ultra-sharp crustaceans that stick to surfaces. I'm sure some of you have slipped on a rock and gotten a nasty cut from these things. Now, imagine your entire body being dragged against them with force. The keelhauled man would be shredded all over, emerging looking like a victim of Freddy Krueger. It was a fate even worse than marooning, where pirates would just leave someone to die on a deserted island. Practice some jokingly called making someone the governor of an island. Back to keel. Sometimes, weights were attached to the man, so the crew pulling the ropes had more control over his body's movement. This had an upside and a downside. He might sink low enough to miss the sharp barnacles, but he might also drown. This punishment was rare, but there are depictions of it in paintings going back to ancient and medieval times. There's a sketch from 5th, 10th, or 16th century England showing the practice. It was even discussed in the British Parliament in 1880, when a politician asked about an alleged instance of keelhauling on the HMS Alexandra, which the Navy denied. There is also a well-known painting titled "The Keelhauling of the Ship as Surgeon of Admiral Jan van Ness." The event happened on a stationary ship in front of many spectators. It seems the punishment wasn't meant to kill the offender, but to serve as a terrifying warning to anyone else thinking of not towing the line. And yes, that expression comes from the Navy. Historians have confirmed that keelhauling did happen in the Dutch Navy. Their descriptions match what we've said. The man was lowered on pulleys and ropes, weights were attached, and he was pulled under and up the other side. Some accounts even say he might have been given a moment to catch his breath before it started all over again. It was even worse in winter, when the water was freezing. In the case involving Admiral Jan van Ness in the 17th century, we unfortunately can't find any record of what the surgeon did to deserve such a wicked treatment. Keelhauling is also described in a book from 1700 called The Relation of Two, Several Voyages Made into the East Indies. Again, it's the Dutch. The book says, "He that strikes an officer is to be thrown into the sea, and drawn up again on the other, and so 3 times together he is drawn round the keel of the ship." It also notes that if they did use enough rope to let him sink below the keel, his brains could be knocked out. So it sounds like sinking lower was actually better. There are other cases described in the journal of a Dutch admiral named Martin Harpetszoon Tromp from 1639. Later, in the 18th century, an Englishman wrote that the English don't do it, but the French do. He described witnessing a French sailor go around the ship 5 times, and that injuries of the most serious nature, or death itself, were certain of being the result. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. We really appreciate your support. See you in the next video.